Warning, this video is only for experienced Dungeons & Dragons players or those that really hate their Dungeon Master or really just have trouble finding one. Being a Dungeon Master is kind of hard. There's a lot of things to worry about. You gotta come up with the story, you gotta play all the characters, do all the role-playing, talk about the environment, deal with all the enemies and creatures and item management, and on top of that, probably even be a rules lawyer for your table. And that's if you can even find a Dungeon Master, because most of the time, people want to be players. They don't really want to run the campaign because of how much work it is. Unless you're willing to pay for a Dungeon Master, which is a viable option, but let's say you don't want to go that route. What are your options instead? Well, what if I told you you could play D&D with zero Dungeon Master? And no, I'm not talking about using some AI bot or booting up Baldur's Gate 3 for the 1000th time. I mean you with a group of your D&D pals just playing D&D but with no Dungeon Master. Well, I think it's possible. You see, thanks to my amazing supporters over on Patreon, I was able to go to Gen Con not too long ago. And while I was there, I got to test play some experimental games. One of which was this incredible game called Legendfall. It's a tabletop role-playing game with a few unique mechanics. It has a card system, which is really cool. It has great art, but it took the Dungeon Master out of the game entirely. And it did this by taking the idea that you have to run the story, the characters, and the role-playing, and the environment, and the item management, and all of the enemies and encounters, and you have to run all the rules and everything. Well, it took all of that and spread it amongst the players. And I wanted to take this concept and apply it directly to D&D. So while I'll have a full intense breakdown of how this can work and how to add some additional flavor to it up on my Patreon, I wanted to discuss it a bit more here first, because the best way to make this work is to assign these particular roles to each individual player. Now, you don't need every one of these roles filled, and you don't need every player to only have one role, because some jobs are just easier than others. But this tends to only work with slightly more experienced groups, because if everybody's a newbie to the game, they're gonna struggle a bit more. So let's start with the first role of your dispersed Dungeon Master organization. This one will hopefully come up the least, especially if you have a more experienced group, and that's the role of the rules lawyer. You might want to give this to the paladin by default. That means somebody in your party is designated as the person who keeps track of the rules. So if you have some sort of homebrew that you're including, you want to make sure that's especially noted. But a lot of times people forget about certain things, like that you can only cast one spell slot using spell in a turn. Or is your table allowing for a rogue to do a sneak attack as their action, but also as their reaction on somebody else's turn? Are they making sure to keep track of the fact that you have disadvantage on ranged attack rolls because an enemy's within 5 feet of you? All of those rules have come up pretty consistently in many of my games. So having somebody designated to call those out and also keep track of any custom rules or homebrews that you have implemented at your table is kind of a big role, but hopefully it comes up less often than anything else. But you need somebody to make that final ruling and be the rules lawyer. Next up, you got the item manager. I'm going to call this role the pack rat. Now, I have great members in my D&D groups that tend to keep track of all of the items that the entire party is dealing with, and it can be a lot of work. They have full-blown spreadsheets of it at certain points. The amount of gold that everybody has and the types of items that are given out and distributed amongst the party, people lose track of them constantly if they're not well documented in their character sheets. But I personally also have a problem as a dungeon master with constantly overpowering my players by giving them way too powerful items. So if you have somebody in place that is just in charge of the items, that can be super helpful. They can be the ones to not only keep track of who has what item, but also what items might drop in an encounter, or what items you might find in a cave or in a miscellaneous treasure box that you're really hoping isn't a mimic. Their job is to not only track the items, but make sure that the items that are given out aren't too powerful. Now, I should note that at this point, you might want to start including some benefits to these roles. See, when I use this method, I tend to actually give some sort of boost, like maybe an extra skill proficiency, or maybe an entire extra feature that gets added in with this role, because I like the pack rat or the loot goblin or whatever you want to call them to have some sort of ability to kind of manage those items a bit more in character. They might have a giant backpack. Maybe you just give them the item, the bag of holding, but maybe they can have something similar to a Goliath, doubling their carry capacity. There's also things that I usually give out, like maybe proficiency in one particular skill, but I'll break all that down on Patreon. Next up, we'll have the role in charge of the environment. You might want to give this to the druid in the party. You see, environments change when you're really immersed in a world. And that's something that you can forget about pretty often, especially in big fights where there's layer actions. You see, just being in charge of the environment isn't just, oh, what's the weather like? Or what's the trees in the random room we're in? Describe it. No, we want to get a bit deeper than that, because in a lot of major encounters in D&D, there's something called layer actions. And if you're fighting some sort of massive creature in a cave where giant rocks or boulders are going to be falling down on the party, you want to have somebody in charge of that, because whoever's going to be running the battle, that's one thing that they're probably going to forget about. Frankly, I constantly forget about legendary actions and layer actions whenever I'm running a big battle. So somebody just being in charge of the environment can be pretty helpful. You see, when I actually got to test play Legendfall, there was somebody in charge of the environment, and we played on a beach, and the tide would come in and out, and that might affect how people interact with the map or how enemies are going to fight and how battle tactics are going to evolve. And just something as small as that can really change the dynamics of how your entire campaign is going to work. Now, it's also relevant in just simple exploration, or maybe the environment of just an actual indoor room that you're in. There's actually somebody in my home game that happens to be a civil or structural engineer. I never remember which one, but he's the one who always comments on, oh no, doors would open this way, not that way. Otherwise, it's not to code, even though you probably wouldn't worry about code in medieval times anyways. But still, having somebody with some idea of how the world physically works can be really helpful and bring a whole new experience to your gameplay. Now, if you want to give somebody some additional proficiency with this, you might give them a skill proficiency with nature. But one thing I personally like to do if I try to make this work in a game is actually to not give yourself proficiency in nature if you have this role, but to give somebody else advantage on nature. Because if you have this role, you want to be the one doing all the descriptions and diving deep into the idea of it. But you don't want to be the one sort of running the whole thing for everybody. You want other people to have that sense of discovery. So being able to dish out advantage on a nature check or a perception check could be pretty important and make sure that people have an additional opportunity to be able to reveal more about the world that they're in. And speaking of the world that they're in, this video is sponsored by dScryb. dScryb would make this entire experience 1,000 times easier because you wouldn't actually have to be coming up with as much right off the top of your head. dScryb would have tons of scenarios, encounters, NPCs, and maps to be able to bring up just by typing in a basic idea. And many of those maps have additional descriptions and things you can hover over to give additional tooltips about what you're seeing in the environment, making a lot of these roles in this video 1,000 times easier to complete. Not to mention, just to set the mood, they have a massive music library to bring a new level of ambiance to your D&D campaigns. I appreciate them supporting this channel by sponsoring this video, and just for my audience, they're offering a free extended trial when you use the code DNDBuilds on checkout. So you can give this a shot in your D&D campaign and see how much easier it makes your life. It's a free extended trial, so it'll give you plenty of time to test it out. And thank you to dScryb for offering to sponsor this video. Really appreciate it. But let's jump back into the next role that I think is very important, which is the enemies and creatures. This isn't just for NPCs. This is actual enemies you might be fighting in D&D. Now, this is going to be one of the more intense roles, and for good reason. It only happens when you're fighting. They will be in charge of the enemy abilities and what they do during battle. This is one of the bigger roles to worry about and one of the more complicated ones. If you're going to default give this to a particular class, you might want to give it to the Ranger as they have a favored enemy. And if you want to give a unique ability to this character, you might want to allow them to have a pool of advantage that they can give out to other players. Almost like they're a bard, but not quite. They don't want to give a bardic inspiration die. You just want to dish out advantage, probably a certain amount of times equal to your proficiency bonus. It's this person's job to keep the fights interesting, challenging, but not too deadly that it would just ruin the campaign. And this is frankly one of the most important roles, depending on how you handle the next two roles. Because the next two roles are kind of optional, which you wouldn't think they would be. Because the next one would be the character role-playing. And I don't mean the characters you're playing. I mean all of the NPCs you're running into. Now, you have somebody to control enemies and creatures you're fighting, which is one thing. But actual NPCs you run into are one of the biggest roles for the role-playing of a dungeon master. So being able to pull that off well is kind of a challenge. However, there's a way that you don't have to do this as a role at all. And it's one thing that breaks one of the biggest rules in any D&D party. You see, there's three ways to incorporate this without an actual dungeon master. First, you have somebody take on the role of the NPC role player. I would highly recommend giving the person with this role the ability to dish out advantage on either insight or persuasion or possibly even deception if they need it. But insight is probably going to be the most important, because if you might be struggling with getting a point across, having insight as an option would be very helpful. If you want to give this to somebody with a default class, you actually don't want to give it to the bard, even though they might be the best role player. It's just because the bards tend to be the face of the party. But if you want to give this to somebody in your group, give it to the one person who always wished they were an actor or a voice actor, or really gets into the role playing way too much at times, but it winds up working out pretty well when you're actually having somebody designated for this role. However, if you don't want a single person designated for this role, there's another option. You roll a set of dice to see who in the group is going to be the role player for that particular NPC you're dealing with. That person has to take on this persona on the spot. It's a slight challenge in improv, but any experienced role player or D&D player would have a great time with this. And the pure randomness of who would take over the role makes it that much more interesting. And if you want, you can make it even easier by encouraging people to split the party. So if one group is checking out the market while the other one's talking to the guards, the group dealing with the market can have somebody from the folks talking to the guards handle the actual role-playing for that scenario. Having a constantly changing group of NPC voices can actually make a more dynamic campaign. But this does encourage a significant amount more collaboration. One, it convinces everybody to be a lot more engaged because everybody's interested in every conversation that's going on. Then if you're dealing with a non-player character who might have items on them or be selling something, then that will bring in the item master or pack rat role, leading to further collaboration. But where it gets especially tricky is when you're dealing with the story. So that leads to the next semi-role, because there might be something important that non-player character might need to know for the sake of the story. And that's where the role of the world builder might be a bit more inclined to give them a little note about something they might want to slip into the conversation. Now, the world builder is another optional role, and you can use 3 different variations of it. One of those is the classic world builder, what your dungeon master would do. They come up with the story, or they come up with some sort of setting, and then the level of improv and randomness that this style of gameplay has allows it to split off naturally, and then you build the world around that. You just have to come up with the initial setting or idea about where the campaign starts. The world builder role only needs to be in place if there's continuing story that you want to evolve in a particular direction. If you want a campaign to be truly random and truly steered by its own levels of character building, then you can kind of let the reins loose. But if a lot of the players are role-playing particular characters that have very in-depth backstories that you want to incorporate into the game, then the world builder's job is to make sure they're incorporated as you go along. And then you just have to make sure that the character whose backstory that's developing has enough notes on it that it's spread to allow whoever's taking over particular NPCs to know enough of what's going on. This can be one of the more difficult jobs, obviously, but there's two other ways to play it. The second, allow it to be totally random. You can just come up with the initial setting of, hey, you met them at a tavern, or there's this big war going on in the background, or some weird idea that popped in your head from a crazy dream you had the night before. Then allow it to just evolve and turn into whatever the heck it can be. But then there's the last option, which is using something that's pre-built or pre-made to some extent and allowing it to flow from there. You can use a pre-made module that D&D has. They got a million of them. Or you can use something like this video's sponsor, dScryb, again, linked in the comments and description down below, to come up with unique scenarios and plot hooks to let the party evolve in their own way. And using something like dScryb would make it 1,000 times easier, because they allow you to search for different story plot hooks or certain situations just by basic concepts. So if you start off in a tavern, you can look up the map for a tavern or the story around a tavern. You select that, and then as the story evolves into some random new thing, you just gotta search that instead. I think it's a unique way to bring some of the modern tools into your game without completely having it run by some AI bot or something. If you want to test out this style of gameplay and let me know how it goes, let me know in the comments down below, because would be so excited to see the outcome. If you want access to a full breakdown of how I would make this work, as well as some unique features I might give each one of these roles, I'll include that up on Patreon. But if you made it all the way to the end of this video, let me know by hitting that like button, and I'll be here helping you roll at least 3 nat 20s in your next D&D session, especially if you want to have a very unique non-Dungeon Master level of experience in D&D.